It knew my father's voice. Not an impression of it, not the way grief sometimes tricks you into hearing a dead man in a stranger's laugh, or in the particular way someone says your name across a crowded room. I mean his voice, his cadence, the softness he kept for private moments, the way he drew out a vowel when he was being careful with something delicate. My father had been dead for 11 years when I heard him speak again. He died in the summer of 1807. I was 9 years old. He died of fever in a Virginia farmhouse not so different from the one I was sitting in when I heard him. And I was in the south field when it happened, and I did not reach his bedside in time. I carried the weight of that for 11 years without setting it down once. He died saying things I never heard until the night of October the 16th, 1818, in a sitting room in Robertson County, Tennessee, when a voice from a dark corner of that room, a corner I had checked 3 times and found empty, said them to me. Andrew Jackson rode to that farm and left before dawn. He never returned. He refused to speak of what happened there for the rest of his life. Major Ezra Pursley, a man I'd personally watched walk through rifle fire without breaking his stride, was found 3 days after our departure, sitting motionless in a field 6 miles away. He never spoke again, not one word. For the remaining 12 years of his life, he sat at windows and looked at things no one else could see, and made no sound and gave no explanation. I stayed 1 extra night. This is my account, in my own words, written in my field journal in October of 1818, sealed in a tin box and hidden beneath the floorboards of the Bell farmhouse, in a place I chose carefully, deep enough that it would not be found by accident, shallow enough that it would be found eventually. It was found in 1953. A contractor renovating the property discovered the tin, wedged between the floor joists, with the deliberateness the man described in a statement recorded by a local historian, as though someone had placed it to last. I intended it to last. I intended it to outlast everyone I knew. I intended it to be read by people for whom the names Jackson and Bell and Pursley were history rather than memory. If you were reading this, and you are, because someone transcribed my words and brought them to you, then I want you to understand one thing before I tell you the rest. Whatever lives beneath that Tennessee farm is not a ghost. I do not know what it is, but it is not a ghost. Ghosts are the dead, residual, diminishing with time. What I encountered in that sitting room was not diminishing. It was accumulating, growing, becoming more, not less, with each passing year. It had been listening for a very long time, and it remembered everything it heard. To understand what happened at the Bell farm, you need to understand the autumn of 1818 and who Andrew Jackson was in that moment of his life. He was 41 years old. He had survived more violence than most men encounter in 3 lifetimes. Duels, battles, wounds that should have killed him and didn't. He had commanded at New Orleans in 1815 and turned a defensive line of frontiersmen and pirates into a force that destroyed a British army. He believed in two things absolutely: the supremacy of human will over circumstance and the inadequacy of anything he couldn't shoot. He did not believe in spirits. He said so explicitly on multiple recorded occasions, with the contempt of a man who considered superstition a form of cowardice. He came to the Bell Farm because someone had convinced him that what was happening there had a natural explanation that had simply not yet been found. And because he was curious, in the way that a man who has seen everything becomes curious about the one thing that doesn't fit the categories he has spent a lifetime building. The Bell family had been on their land since 1804. John Bell was a man of substance and community standing, a church elder, a prosperous farmer, a neighbour whose word was reliable. His wife Lucy was a woman I can only describe as composed in the specific way of someone who had no choice but to become that way. Their daughter Betsy was 16 at the time of our visit. She looked older. The disturbances had been occurring for 2 years before we arrived. They began in the summer of 1817, when the Bell family was breaking ground on a new root cellar on the southern end of the property. Some say nothing particular happened during the digging. Some say Bell's spade struck something beneath the clay that rang when it shouldn't have, and that he filled the hole back in and never spoke of what he'd found. What every account agrees on is this: starting in the late summer of 1817, the Bell household was subjected to something that 2 years of investigation, prayer, and desperate rationalization had failed to explain or stop. Stones thrown against the exterior walls in the deep of night, chains dragged across the attic floorboards, furniture found displaced in locked rooms. The family's dog, by all accounts a steady, fearless animal, found dead at the fence line in August of 1817 with no visible cause. And the voices. It was the voices that drew Jackson. I had read all the available accounts before we departed Nashville. I had catalogued them the way a soldier catalogues terrain before a campaign, looking for patterns, for the repeating detail that tells you something true about the landscape. What I found in every account, regardless of the source or their disposition toward the supernatural, was this: the voices knew things. Not general things, specific things. The kind of things a person knows only from prolonged proximity, from being present in rooms where people are most themselves, from listening across years to the private language of a family that believed itself alone. That was the detail that made Jackson curious enough to ride south. Whatever was speaking in that farmhouse had not simply appeared. It had been there for a long time, long enough to know. Robertson County in October is one of the more beautiful parts of the American interior. The Cumberland River Valley in late autumn has a quality of light that makes everything seem slightly more itself than usual. The colors deeper, the shadows more defined, the air carrying the mineral coldness of water beginning to slow toward winter. The Bell farm sat in a cleared depression between two low ridges. The fences were straight. The outbuildings were in good repair. The house itself was solid and clean and well kept. It looked entirely ordinary. What it felt like was a different matter. I have been in enough dangerous places to know what the body does before the mind catches up. The shoulders tighten. The breathing shortens. The eyes begin moving faster than you realize, scanning for the thing the instinct has already registered that the conscious mind hasn't yet named. My body did that the moment we rode through the gate. Major Pursley noticed it too. He said nothing at the time, but I watched him take out his notebook immediately upon dismounting and write something. I read that entry later. He had written, "Property presents as normal. Atmosphere does not. Recommend observation before assumption." The horses were the first clear evidence. Jackson's horse, a tough, seasoned animal that had been through battle without flinching, stopped at the gate and required significant persuasion to proceed. Not the skittishness of a young horse encountering something new, the flat, planted resistance of an animal that has made a considered decision. The Bell livestock were in their paddocks and pens. All of them. Every animal stood with a uniformity of posture I had never seen before. All facing the same direction, away from the house. Their ears flat, their eyes showing white at the corners. Every single one. Jackson looked at the animals, and then he looked at the house, and he said nothing. John Bell met us at the door, a tall man, going grey at the temples and in his beard, with the particular exhaustion in his face that comes not from lack of sleep, but from too many months of poor sleep, accumulated until they have become a permanent condition. Lucy Bell came to the doorway behind her husband. She looked at each of us with the precise, assessing eyes of a woman who has been managing something very difficult for a long time. Betsy Bell stood at the edge of the doorway and did not come forward and did not speak. She looked at the ground. In 2 years, I understood later, she had become very careful about maintaining the expression of someone who is not listening to anything. She was always listening. We were given the parlour for our party, 7 men in total. We were given supper, which was excellent. I mention this because it strikes me as significant that the Bell household continued to produce excellent hospitality through 2 years of what they were enduring. Whatever it cost Lucy Bell to maintain that composure, I cannot calculate. After supper, Jackson invited John Bell to speak plainly about what was happening. Bell spoke for nearly an hour. His account was methodical and chronological, delivered in the flat tone of a man who has told a story many times and has given up expecting to be believed. Jackson said, "We'll see what we see." That night around 11 o'clock, we saw something. The sitting room of the Bell house was built around a large stone hearth. By 11 o'clock, the fire had been stoked high and the lamps were burning well, and the whole arrangement of warm light was comfortable in the way that makes a man's skepticism feel reasonable. I think this is precisely what the entity understood about us. Major Pursley had positioned himself in the corner nearest the window with his notebook open. Jackson sat in the most prominent chair with the posture of a man who has decided that whatever is coming, he will receive it from a position of authority. Betsy Bell sat in her chair by the fire and did not look at any of us, and did not speak, and kept her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that looked like someone bracing for impact. The first sound was what Bell had described as a stone against the wall. A single sharp impact from outside, with enough force to make the lamplight tremble. Jackson did not move. His jaw tightened slightly. He said, "Probably an animal." The second sound came immediately after, not from outside, from directly above us, from the attic space over the sitting room. The sound of something heavy being dragged across wooden boards. Long, slow, deliberate. The specific rhythm of it communicating something I struggled to name at the time, but can name now. Intention. It sounded like something deciding where to move. Jackson sent 2 men upstairs with lanterns. They were up there for 4 minutes. They came back and reported nothing. Undisturbed dust on the attic floor. No marks of passage. No evidence of anything. The dragging sound began again the moment they cleared the bottom step. This time, it was in the room. In the corner behind Betsy Bell's chair. A corner I had personally checked upon entering and found empty. The lamplight reached it fully. There was no shadow large enough to conceal anything that could produce that sound. And yet, the sound was there. Heavy, measured, slow. Major Pursley wrote something in his notebook and did not look up. The sound stopped. In the silence that followed, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, the way it drops when a door opens onto winter. Sudden and complete. Jackson's breath clouded in front of his face. One of the soldiers swore quietly. I watched frost appear on the inside of the window glass in approximately 10 seconds. The fire burned normally. The lamps burned normally. The temperature in the room had simply fallen. Then the voice spoke. I want to be precise about this because precision matters, and because memory has a tendency to round the edges off impossible things until they fit inside the possible. I do not want to do that. The voice came from the empty corner behind Betsy Bell's chair. Not from behind the wall, not from above or below. From a specific point in the room, approximately 4 feet off the floor. From empty air. It was not a whisper. It was a clear, full voice. The voice of a man in middle age, measured and deliberate, choosing his words with care. It said a name, not one of ours, a name none of Jackson's party recognized. Said it with the particular warmth of someone who has not spoken a beloved name in a long time and is glad of the occasion. Then it was quiet for perhaps 5 seconds. Then it said, "Andrew, You know what you did at the Bend. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend, March of 1814. Jackson's forces against the Red Stick Creek warriors. 800 dead. The battle that made Andrew Jackson's national reputation. The battle that also involved a specific order. A decision made in a moment of fury that exceeded the accepted conduct of war, that only a handful of men had ever known about, and that Jackson had spent 4 years hoping would remain buried. The voice named that order precisely, correctly, in the voice of a Creek warrior who had died in that battle. A man whose name Jackson had heard spoken only once through an interpreter before the fighting began. I watched Andrew Jackson's face. I have seen men in many different kinds of difficulty. I have seen men afraid in ways that make them fight harder, and afraid in ways that make them freeze, and afraid in ways that break something essential in them. What I saw on Jackson's face in that moment was none of those. It was the expression of a man confronting something that should not exist and that he cannot shoot. He stood up from his chair. He did not run. He walked with the measured, controlled pace of a man exerting enormous effort over every muscle to the front door of the house. He opened it. He walked out into the night. He did not come back until dawn. And in the morning, he said only 4 words. We leave at first light. Major Parsley and I remained in the sitting room. The soldiers retreated to the kitchen. I cannot blame them. What had happened had not been explained or resolved. It had simply occurred. And in the vacuum of Jackson's departure, there was nothing holding the room's normality together, except Parsley's continued presence and the steady sound of his pen. Betsy Bell had not moved. The voice came again approximately 10 minutes after Jackson left, and then other voices, and then others still, cycling through them the way a man cycles through the pages of a book. Some were identifiable as men or women by their register. Some spoke in languages other than English. French, I recognized. And at one point, something that sounded like a native tongue I could not name. Major Parsley wrote down everything he could, his pen moving without pause, occasionally asking a quiet question that the voice or voices sometimes answered and sometimes ignored. What I was observing, and this took me several hours to articulate to myself, was not random. The voices had access to specific, verifiable information about specific deceased individuals. This was not the general knowledge a charlatan collects through cold reading and inference. It was intimate, personal, the kind of knowledge that exists only in private moments, when people are most completely themselves, when they believe themselves unobserved. Parsley wrote in his notebook, in an entry I read by his permission much later, the entity demonstrates biographical knowledge of deceased individuals that cannot be obtained through observation of the living. The knowledge is of a character that suggests direct access, not inference from available evidence, but first-hand presence at private moments. If we are to accept the evidence of our senses, The entity has been present in the private lives of these individuals during their lifetimes. It has been listening continuously, and it retains what it hears with perfect fidelity. Perfect fidelity. That phrase settled into me and stayed. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, one of the other soldiers came to find me. He said Garrett, a man from Kentucky who had served with Jackson since the Creek campaigns, was behaving strangely in the kitchen, not responding to his name, eyes open but not seeing the room. I went to him, knelt beside him, said his name. He looked at me with the eyes of someone coming up from somewhere very deep and said, "It said my mother's name. And then it said something my mother said to me when I was 4 years old, when my father left. The thing she said when she thought I was asleep. I was awake," he said. "I heard her and never told anyone. In my entire life, I never told a single person." "How does it know that?" he said. I did not have an answer for him that night, but I was already beginning to build one. A spy could gather information. A fraudster with enough preparation could learn family histories, surnames, the general contours of recent deaths. But no preparation possible could account for what the voices produced. The particular word a dying man chose in his final hour. The private sentence a mother spoke to a sleeping child in a house no one else had entered. The only explanation that fit was the one I most did not want to consider. The entity had been present for those moments. In the room, at the bedside, present in the way that a thing is present when it occupies the same space as the living, and the living simply have not noticed it. It had been listening to the dead before they were the dead, for a very long time. Jackson left at first light. He came in from wherever he had spent the night. The stable, I believe. He had that look of cold and straw about him, and said to each of us, "We leave within the hour." No discussion, no explanation. The tone that ended conversations. Within the hour, we were mounted and riding north toward Nashville. All of us except me. I have tried in the years since to explain precisely to myself why I stayed. I was 22 years old. I was not a reckless man. I had the ordinary courage of a soldier, which is not the same as bravery, but is sometimes mistaken for it in the dark. What I was, I think, was incomplete. What I had heard in that sitting room the night before had not finished with me. The voice had spoken to Jackson. It had spoken toward Pursley. It had found Garrett in the kitchen with something personal and precise and devastating. It had cycled through its collection for hours, returning one dead person's words to the people who had outlived them. It had not spoken to me. I did not consciously think, "It is going to speak to me tonight," but I did not leave. Betsy Bell, passing me in the hallway in the late afternoon, paused and looked at me for a moment with those two old eyes and said, quietly, without drama, the way someone states a logistical fact. It prefers fewer people. It gets more specific when there aren't as many of us. Then she walked on. I sat alone in the sitting room with the fire and a lamp and my field journal. I sat the way you sit on watch, in a position that may or may not come under fire, in a state of controlled readiness, prepared for something without knowing the shape of it. At 20 minutes past 10, the temperature dropped. The fire burned normally. The lamp burned normally. The cold came into the room the way it had come the night before, as a presence rather than a draft, filling the space from the far corner, gradual and deliberate. I kept writing in my journal. I wrote, temperature decreasing, fire and lamp unaffected. The corner is empty. I am not going to look up from this page immediately. I am going to keep writing until something requires me to stop. And then the voice said, Thomas. The way my father said my name in private moments, the register he kept for when something was delicate. I put down the pen. I should tell you something about my father before I tell you what happened next. He was a man of few words, in the specific way of men who have chosen their few words carefully. He was not cold. He was not distant. He was someone who understood that words are a finite resource and should not be spent carelessly. And so when he spoke, what he said tended to matter. He called me Thomas in two registers. The ordinary one was level and clear. My full name used the way a man uses a name when he is simply addressing a person. The other register, the one he kept for private moments, was fractionally softer, a fraction lower. It was the voice he used when something was delicate, when he was being careful with me. The voice from the corner of that room used the private register. I looked up from my journal. The corner was empty. No shape, no shadow that moved. The cold in the room had settled into something steady, the temperature of a deep cave that maintains itself regardless of the season above it. I said, Father. I am not embarrassed to have said it. I would say it again. The voice said, You were not there when I went. You were in the south field. My father died on a July afternoon in 1807. I was 9 years old. I had been sent to check the corn rows after a storm. I was in that field when my mother came running. I was not at his side when he died. I had been told in the years after that he had called for me at the end. I had carried the weight of not having heard him for 11 years. The voice said, I did not call for you. I held very still. I did not want you to see it. I chose not to call. I want you to know that. I had never been told this. In the years after, my mother had said only that he had asked for me. Whether she believed this, or whether she said it to spare me a particular weight, or whether she simply didn't know, I had never been certain which was true. The voice said, I want you to know it was a choice and not an oversight. Then it said something else, something I will not write here in full, because it belongs to my family and to no one else. Something private between my father and myself, concerning a matter in our family that had never been spoken of openly, that I had wondered about for years, and that the voice explained fully and correctly in a way I was able to confirm through other means in the years that followed. My father had known something. He had kept it from me during his life because he had judged me too young to carry it. He had apparently not been able to keep it from the thing in the earth beneath a Tennessee farm, which had collected it along with everything else he had ever said in the privacy of his own life, and which was now, 11 years after his death, returning it to me. I sat with that for a long time after the voice went quiet. I was not paralyzed. I was not weeping. I was doing the thing a practical man does when he encounters something that exceeds his framework, sitting very still and trying to rebuild the framework around the new information. Somewhere in the deep limestone beneath a Tennessee farm, something had collected my father's voice. The things he said in private that he thought no one heard. The things he said in dying that I was not there to hear. It had kept them. For 11 years it had kept them. It had returned them the way a person returns a lost object. Because it possessed the item and I was there to receive it, that was what I sat with until dawn. The entity is a collector. This is the best word I have arrived at in the years since. I do not mean by it that the entity is benevolent. I do not mean that it is malevolent. I mean that collection is what it does, that the accumulation of what it gathers constitutes something that functions for it the way memory functions for a person. It collects voices. More precisely, it collects the voices and the private speech of people in the moments of their lives when they are most truthful. The private moments, the moments before death in particular, the final confessions, the unsaid things finally said, the private language of the dying. It has access to these moments because it is present for them. It lives in the earth, beneath the places where people live and die, and it listens. It has been doing this for a very long time. The Bell Farm sits above a formation of limestone that runs deep into the hill on the southern edge of the property. There is a cave entrance in that hill, a dark mouth in the pale rock, visible from the cleared fields, unremarkable as a landscape feature until you understand what it opens into. What I believe happened in the summer of 1817 is not that John Bell created something. I believe he opened something. The root cellar broke through a barrier between the upper earth and whatever space the entity occupies in the deep limestone, and the entity, which had been present beneath that land since before any living person's memory, found itself suddenly connected to the surface world in a new way. It began to speak. Not from anger, not from intention in any sense I can confidently describe. I believe it speaks because speaking is one of the things it can do with what it has collected. The way a man who has spent years gathering books will read aloud from them when given an audience, not for any specific purpose, because the library is there and the reading is possible. The private information, the things it knew about the Bell family, about Jackson's history at Horseshoe Bend, about Garrett's mother, about my father, is not evidence of supernatural intelligence in any dramatic sense. It is evidence of long, patient listening. It had kept everything. What it told me about my father was not a revelation from beyond death. It was a retrieval.
My father had said those things in private, in a moment when he thought himself alone, and the thing in the earth heard and retained what it heard and returned it to me 11 years later with perfect fidelity. It has been accumulating for a very long time. It is still accumulating. Every person who dies within range of its attention becomes part of its collection. The dead are in there, their voices, their private words, the things they said when they were most themselves, kept with perfect fidelity, waiting for the right moment, the right number of people in the room, the right configuration of quiet and cold, to be returned. I left the Bell Farm at sunrise on the 17th of October, 1818. I rode north to Nashville and gave my report to Jackson in a meeting that lasted approximately 12 minutes. He listened without expression. At the end, he said, "You will not speak of this." I said, "I am aware of that, General." He said, "For your own sake, not mine. People have been committed to institutions for less than what you're describing." He was not threatening me. He was telling the truth about the world as he understood it. Major Ezra Pursley was found 3 days after our departure, sitting motionless in a field 6 miles from the Bell Farm. He was physically unharmed. He appeared to be listening to something. A physician who examined him found no physical cause for his condition. His notebooks from our visit, which I knew contained extensive observations and analysis that would have been more valuable than any document I have encountered in my life, were seized by men I was not introduced to within a week of his return. They disappeared as thoroughly as if they had never existed. Pursley never spoke again, not one word. For the remaining 12 years of his life, he sat at windows and watched things no one else could see, and made no sound and gave no explanation. He died in 1830. His family said he had been peaceful at the end. The soldiers who had been with us were reassigned to various postings across different territories. The effect was that the members of Jackson's party who had been present in that sitting room were separated before any of us had the opportunity to compare our experiences. Andrew Jackson was elected President of the United States in 1828. He served 2 terms. He never publicly discussed the Bell Farm. In a letter written in 1835 to his friend John Coffey, a letter which surfaced at auction in 1904, he described a night in Tennessee only as the most frightened he had ever been in his life. Not because the thing was violent, he wrote, but because it knew too much. He wrote, "It knew what the dead know, John, and the dead know more about us than we choose to remember." John Bell died in December of 1820. He had been declining for over a year. The entity in the months before his death was, by the family's account, at its most active. It spoke to John Bell constantly. Betsy Bell told a visiting minister in 1819 that it spoke to her father the way a creditor speaks to a debtor, as if something was owed, as if the breaking of the seal in the summer of 1817 had not been an accident, but a transgression, and the entity was, in its patient way, collecting what it was due. They found a vial near his body, a dark, viscous liquid. No one ever identified its contents. The physician noted an unusual smell about Bell in his final days. Metallic, he said, like old copper. After John Bell's death, the disturbances diminished significantly. The entity, it appeared, had what it came for, or more precisely, it had added to what it had always been keeping. John Bell's voice was in there now, his private words, his final hours. Whatever he said in the long months of his dying that he believed he was saying only to the people beside him. Betsy Bell married eventually and left the property. She refused to speak of the farm until late in her life, and then only to her daughter. The grandson who eventually confirmed this account told me one thing his grandmother had said. She had said, "It does not leave. It only grows less interested." The difference between those two things is not as large as you would like it to be. I am addressing you directly now. I am writing this in October of 1818, and I am speaking to you across whatever distance of years separates us. And I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying. I am not saying the Bell Farm is haunted in any sense that the popular understanding applies to that word. I am not saying a dead man's soul is trapped in a cave in Tennessee seeking resolution. I am not offering comfort, and I am not offering clarity. I am saying that something lives beneath that land, something that has been there for longer than any record extends, something that collects the voices of people who die within its reach and retains them with perfect accuracy, and returns them sometimes to the living people who were most connected to the dead. The Bell Farm still stands. Every subsequent owner has reported the same phenomena: the voices, the temperature drops, the objects displaced in locked rooms. The cave on the southern edge of the property is, by all accounts, still active. People enter that cave and describe sounds. Breathing, they say. Whispering. The words, when they can be made out, are always names. The names of people known personally to the person in the cave. The names of their dead. I want you to understand what the Bell Witch is. Not the legend, not the story as it has been told and distorted in the years since. The thing itself. The thing itself is a collector of an almost unimaginable patience. It has been present in the private moments of generations of human lives. It has heard the prayers and the confessions and the arguments and the deathbed words of every person who died within its range. It has kept all of it. The living are, to this entity, future collections. Not in a malevolent sense, in the sense that a library awaits new books. The entity does not hasten death. It simply waits, with the specific patience of something that does not experience time the way we experience it, for the people within its reach to die. And then it keeps what they leave. I want you to think about what that means. I want you to think about the last thing you said in private. The thing you said when you thought you were alone. The thing you said to someone you loved who has since died that you have not repeated to anyone, because some things are only for the people they were said to. In whatever places the entity's reach extends, what you said in those moments was heard, and it is being kept. My father's voice is in there. My own voice is in there now, given that I spoke aloud in that sitting room on the night of October the 16th, 1818. I find that I am not, on reflection, as disturbed by that as I would have expected to be.
What disturbs me is not that my voice will be kept. It is the question of what it will be used for. I do not know when it will choose to return mine.
I do not know who will be in the room when it does. I do not know what it will decide they needed to hear. I am sealing this journal now. I am placing it between the joists of this floor in a position I have selected carefully, deep enough to last, shallow enough to be found. What I want you to understand is this: the dead are still speaking. They are being kept by something that has been listening since before we arrived on this land, and will continue listening after we are gone. Whatever you said today that you thought no one heard, someone heard, and it is being kept. Where history ends and our story begins, we will let you decide where the line falls. Whisper your next nightmare in the comments.